Okay, I'm going to talk about the age of Jackson here. Um, the dominant political figure of the period from 1820 to 1850 is Andrew Jackson, and it's often called the age of the common man, or the egalitarian age, or the era of democracy, or something like that. But all of it has to do with opening up the democratic process to more people, and that was associated with Jackson, rightly or wrongly. So here's what we're going to cover in the, uh, yeah, they're opening up the democratic process, how to get your face on at 20, talk about Jackson as a symbol for the age. There's some cartoons. Talk about the issues that marked the Jackson era, the Bank War nullification and Indian removal, and deal with the Cherokee removal and the Trail of Tears. Okay, so that's pretty much what we're doing in this lecture. Now, as I said, the biggest reform movement was this opening up of the democratic process. I personally don't think Jackson was responsible for all this, but he's associated with it. Poor white males got the right to vote. That had been going on before, in the 18th century. It had been going on for a long time. More poor people were becoming voters. Whiteness and maleness became more a badge of citizenship than anything. And so for white men, this was a real democratizing effect. And they turned out to vote. Politics was very much the great interest of the day. People, more than 80% of the voters voted in 1840. And so we see increasing levels of turnout and identification of people with their political party, which was reinforced by party newspapers, by every city having a Democratic newspaper and a Whig newspaper, and that this kind of identification with the party unapologetically was thought to be a good thing. Parties during the 1830s started to have national conventions, and partially because they finally opened up hotels, and so lots of people could gather in a hotel, and they didn't have to rely on city taverns and inns for travelers to come here. And so this was perceived as a more democratic way to choose a candidate than what had been going on before, which was a bunch of congressmen meeting in a smoke-filled room to choose a candidate. Parties began to print ballots and rely on printed voting, and so people began to associate that with casting a ballot. Before that, believe it or not, the main practice was viva voce voting, which was by voice. You would announce who you were backing, because a good Republican citizen should be proud to cast this ballot and make sure that you could do this before your peers. Well, printed ballots weren't secret ballots. That didn't come about until the 1890s, really, but they were a step in that direction. And one more thing was the spoils system. To the victors belong the spoils, the goodies on the battlefield that you take off dead bodies. If you are victorious in an election, you can appoint your backers to office, and that system of patronage, of especially post office jobs, was considered to be a good thing. It's a common man's government, and they should be able to make up the ranks of the government. So all this came about in the 1820s and 30s. Now, we left Jackson kind of licking his wounds in the period after the election of 1824. Remember, he got the most votes, but he wasn't elected president. This was a natural occurrence, but he blamed it on kind of a conspiracy of politicians to prevent the will of the people, basically him, to be elected. So in the election of 1828, Jackson and his lieutenant, Martin Van Buren, had organized the Democratic Party in an election against John Quincy Adams and his alignment with Henry Clay and what were going to become the Whigs. And more than twice as many people voted in 1828 as in 1824, but Jackson won this rematch. They accused, despite the fact that he was accused of being marrying another man's wife, and this eventually contributed to the death of his wife, Rachel Carson. And so it was a dirty campaign. It was the Jacksonians accused Quincy Adams of being an aristocrat, of having a billiard table in the White House. This is outrageous. So Jackson came to the presidency, and the mob came to Washington, D.C. and supported him and drank the punch. There were 10,000 of them at the White House on the day of the inauguration, and they almost crushed the president, but then they realized they should put the punch outside on the lawn, and that brought the crowd outside with it. So, Jackson is a symbol of an age, of his age. His personality had within it nature, providence, and will, and people associated these qualities with Jackson and with the United States, with America. Americans like to feel that they're connected to God, to nature, and to this incredible can-do spirit of willpower. So the personality of Jackson has a lot to do with his popularity. He was a child of nature. He was the first president whose family had been poor when he was a boy growing up. They came from the backwoods. They were not big landowners or aristocrats. Now, eventually, Jackson will become the wealthiest man in Tennessee. He will own more than 300 slaves. He becomes a wealthy person, but he has this image of being a child of nature, a man who was part of the country while it was still raw and unsettled. He made his name as a frontier leader, as basically an Indian killer who knew their ways, but he was a lawyer from Nashville who had stood for the bar, and becoming a lawyer in those days was a different process than it is now. You basically just had to know a judge who would let you pass the bar and stand on the other side of it. So Jackson said he couldn't respect a man that couldn't think of more than one way to spell a word. He is said to be the source of a famous abbreviation in our language, it being okay. He would put this on memos that passed his desk. That's the story. And he was basically saying, all correct, that the OK was a misspelling. Anyway, he was a child of nature, um, and this was pretty much stood him well. He was blessed by providence. He was, you can't kind of consider the death figures from the Battle of New Orleans. 80 Americans killed and about 2,200 British, without seeing the hand of God in it. God uniquely blessed Andrew Jackson just like he uniquely blessed the United States. And Americans like to feel that about themselves. And Jackson was also the possessor of an indomitable will. He had extraordinary willpower. He brought that willpower to all of the politics and disputes he had as a professional. There's a story that when in 1803, when he was fought a duel with John Dickinson, you see it pictured here, that Dickinson accused Jackson of marrying another man's wife. This was a charge that would be repeated again and again. And Jackson challenged Dickinson to a duel. But Dickinson was the Tennessee state champion for accuracy with pistols, so he was the best shot in the state. But Jackson didn't care. He was fighting for justice. So they met on the field of honor. They took 10 paces. Jackson was wearing a loose cloak. It was a misty morning. He's 6'2", 150. He's old hickory. Dickinson raised his arm and fired at Jackson. The bullet entered Jackson's chest about 1 inch from the heart, and all the eyewitnesses to the duel said the same thing, that Jackson kind of steadied himself he was knocked off balance a bit, so he steadied himself, calmly raised his arm, and shot and killed Dickinson right there. And so he was quite the stud. He just a flesh wound. He said that when he was vetoing the Bank of the United States, and he squeezed Vice President Van Buren's hand to the point that Van Buren was convinced it was going to break every bone in his hand. But Jackson, who was suffering from a migraine headache, said, "The bank is trying to kill me, Mr. Van Buren, but I will kill it." And he did. He vetoed it and destroyed it. He said on his deathbed in 1845 that he had 2 regrets in life, that he had not hanged John C. Calhoun or shot Henry Clay. He couldn't quite let it go. So he was a man of great willpower, and I feel like Americans respect that about people, that you may not even agree with a lot of what he believed in, but you appreciated and respected the power of his will. And so that kind of brand of frontier justice was what Americans saw in Jackson. Okay. So there's a poster for Jackson and a cartoon that shows him as the great father to the Native Americans. Now, there are 3 issues that I want you to know about. The bank war nullification and Indian removal. on the bank war, it's important on nullification. That came about in 1832. Jackson's vice president, John C. Calhoun, for his first term, was the author of this nullification resolution in South Carolina, which said that a state having been in existence before the national government, having created the national government, stood as the final guarantor of the liberties of the people and could intervene when the country was clearly doing something unconstitutional. The states could decide not to obey a federal law. Well, Jackson basically said in 1832, yes, you will obey federal law. So when they, in South Carolina, announced they wouldn't pay the tariff anymore, Jackson called up 10,000 troops to put down the rebellion of the South Carolinians, and that threat led to them working out a compromise that avoided war. But you saw the lines being drawn that would eventually lead to the secession of South Carolina. The bank war that was fought also in 1832, Jackson didn't trust banks. He didn't like paper money. He spoke out his whole career against banks and the way that they use their resources to enrich themselves or their stockholders and basically take the money from the little man. So he hated it. Well, Nicholas Biddle, the Bank of the United States president, and Henry Clay worked out a deal where Congress rechartered the National Bank, the Bank of the United States, 4 years early. So this would put Jackson in an uncomfortable position. He can either veto the bank and prove that he knows nothing about the economy and he doesn't understand the role that the bank plays in keeping the economy humming along, or he can be proven to be a hypocrite who has said all these terrible things about banks but was willing to let them exist. Well, he issued the bank veto message, which was very powerful and very popular, that identified the moneyed interest as the real enemy. And so he destroyed the bank, he got rid of it, and won re-election in 1832, proving that he may not have known anything about economics, but he knew a lot about politics. So that worked out for him in the short run. In the long run, the absence of the bank led to a huge depression starting in 1837 that his successor, Martin Van Buren, had to deal with, and eventually led to the Whigs taking over power from him. And then Indian removal was basically Jackson getting rid of the Cherokee Indians and the other Indian tribes who lived east of the Mississippi and taking them west of the Mississippi. And he did this in an inhumane manner, and it was terrible on the Cherokees. They lost at least 1/4 of their number in the Trail of Tears moving west. But Jackson's explanation for why he removed the Indians was that they would have to move far away from white people in order to retain their civilization. He wanted them to have that opportunity. So that's what he said. And the Supreme Court weighed in on this and said basically that the Americans had to leave the Cherokees alone. They'd signed treaties guaranteeing that they could keep these lands. and they're just going to have to figure out a way to survive with Cherokees in their midst. But Jackson is said to have said, Chief Justice has made his decision, now let him enforce it. Basically saying, I'm the president, I enforce the laws, I choose to take the Cherokees out of here. So he disobeyed the courts and pushed for their removal. So Jackson was a powerful president. He shaped the president's office into a powerful institution. You've got Jackson on one side of a $20 bill and the White House on the other. So he unwittingly kind of created the world that could lead to the victory of another war hero, William Harrison, and his vice president, John Tyler, a Democrat in Whig's clothing. And they would fight against most of the Whig program that Clay was still promoting at this time. So his presidency was kind of a real lightning rod for different forces in the country at the time. Okay, thanks.